The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
The day I was developing the outline for this podcast, smoke and haze from wildfires in Canada were affecting millions of Canadians across the 6 largest provinces. The air quality index in the city of Toronto and surrounding areas was a 10 plus, or very high risk, causing, among other things, Canada Post to suspend mail delivery in some places. Over 80 million people in the United States were affected by smoke and poor air quality. And oh yes, Spain, Portugal, and France were starting to experience the impacts of smoke from the worst Canadian wildfire season on record. Today, as we tape this podcast, there are over 500 wildfires burning across Canada. Well, Jeff, that's a pretty gloomy way to start off Season 6, Episode 4. My co-host, Jeff King, is the national lead of the Engineering with Nature program with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Jeff, with the wildfire season in Canada at an all-time high, you wanted to make sure we talked with a prominent Canadian scientist about wildfires as soon as possible.
Yes, and so delighted to have our guest on today. With the news being what it is, there's a lot of concern focused on wildfires, and all of our Canadian colleagues and friends are certainly dealing with a lot right now. And certainly we think about this from the standpoint of climate change and what we're seeing in real time. Very much concerned about the wildfires in Canada, but also what wildfire season will bring to the U.S. this year. When we think about the wildfires in Canada, certainly we are seeing those impacts in the U.S. as well, with impacts as far as Missouri and Kentucky. That in the way of heavy smoke, bad air advisories, activities that get canceled, and also significant risk to health. And we share a lot more with Canada than just the border. I mean, if you think about it, with the smokes from the wildfires, we saw several airports being closed, shut down in the Northeast. The smoke and the wildfires also impacting life and health and safety in Quebec and Nova Scotia. And there's a lot of connectivity there, a lot of connectivity between Canada and the U.S. And so because of these wildfires, I certainly wanted to make sure that we reached out to our Canadian friends and colleagues and had them give us a firsthand account of what's happening up there, and then also what the government of Canada is doing about these wildfires.
Well, with a little help from our friend Enda Murphy from NRCan, the National Research Council of Canada, we were introduced to our guest, Anabela Bonada. Anabela is the Manager and Research Associate at the Intact Centre for Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And among other things, she's an expert in forest fires, and she's been actively involved in the development of Canada's National Wildfire Guide. Welcome, Anabela.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here, get a chance to speak with you about the forest fires that we're experiencing up here in Canada. And as Jeff mentioned, even though it's happening north of the border, lots of the impacts are being felt south. So all the way to southern U.S. as well. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about wildfire this season.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and we know that you're in great demand, especially right now. Maybe we could start by asking you to put the scope and scale of wildfires in Canada today in perspective for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So as we're taping the show right now, we have 625 wildfires burning across the country. Over 322 of them are classified as out of control. Canada's Interagency Forest Fire Center reports that over 85,000 kilometers squared, or almost 33,000 square miles, have been burned so far. This is across Canada, and this is the most that has been burned on record. This is equivalent to New Brunswick, actually a little bit more than New Brunswick and PEI combined, and a little bit bigger than South Carolina. So as I mentioned, this is the worst wildfire season on record for Canada, and we're now getting into deeper in the season. The season starts around May, and it'll go on till October. Half of the wildfires are caused by lightning, and the other half by human behavior. And we're seeing tremendous impacts on the forests with area burned, wildfire, biodiversity being affected, pests. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of impact on communities, individuals, evacuations happening in different places, and significant health impacts as well. As we mentioned, the wildfire smoke, that's impacting millions of people, not just the people near the wildfires.
Anabela, those numbers are absolutely staggering. When I think about the acreage that you just described and what all has been burned to date. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on, where is this going with the droughts that we continue to experience both in the U.S. and Canada and other impacts associated with climate change? What's the prognosis here? Are we going to continue to see record-breaking fires throughout this year and perhaps years in the future?
Unfortunately, yes, that is the prognosis. We're expecting to have drier and warmer summers, drier and warmer winters going forward here in Canada and equally in parts of the US, and drier and warmer springs. And this leads to longer and more extreme fire seasons. So it's not looking very good for us. So I'd say we need to take action now. We have to start thinking all the way from policymakers right down to every individual. So the focus of my work at the Intact Center is to develop easy to follow, actionable guidance for residents, businesses, governments, so we can start to adapt to the changes that are occurring with these wildfire seasons that will just continue to get worse.
Anabela, I've been reading certainly in the news in the last few days that we're now experiencing El Nino. How does that affect the wildfire situation today, but maybe like next year as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's all over the news currently that we are actually have started the El Nino year. And what that means is that surface ocean temperatures are going to be warmer this year. They've already warmed up 2 degrees Celsius compared to a normal year. And for North America, it means that we're going to see drier, warmer climate on the northwest, but you might actually see some flooding and lots of storms in southern U.S. So for those areas that are usually wildfire prone, like the west and the northwest, and in Canada, if we're going to experience a drier and warmer climate with El Nino, the expectation is more wildfire, as in size and intensity. So we're going to see bigger wildfires because we're going to have more fuel on the ground after having a drier year. So as you mentioned, El Nino really takes off in the winter. So if we have a drier winter, which is similar to what we just had, and a drier spring, next early spring is of concern again for wildfire. So we'll be looking out for that.
Can you talk a little bit about what's being done in Canada? You and your colleagues are looking ahead to pass this forest fire season to the future. What's being done? Talk about some of the work that your colleagues at FireSafe and are doing, for example.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work being done in Canada to raise awareness, to make communities more resilient. So our group in particular at the Intact Center, we develop easy to follow guidance. So what we have right now are 2 wildfire infographics. One of them is for the home level and the other one the community level. Really to get ahead of wildfire, it is a community response, but there are things that you can do around your home. Simple things, as you'll see on the infographic, to a bit more complex. So simple is move any combustible material up to 10 meters away from your home. More complex is if you're thinking of updating your roof. If it's time for that and you're in a wildfire-prone area, consider a Class A roof that is resistant to wildfire. And for the community, community design should really include some fire breaks that are about 30 meters wide, depending on your area. And also consider having a designated shelter place. So if you have to evacuate, or if a community nearby needs to evacuate, maybe a community center could serve as a shelter as well. And we've collaborated a lot with Fire Smart Canada. They are the leaders in the country for creating Canadian communities that are resilient to wildfire. So they have many resources for landscaping around your home, improvements to your home, your community, that'll make you more wildfire resilient. Additionally, Canada just released the final national adaptation strategy and includes targets for wildfire. So they're really looking to have communities that are wildfire prone have a plan in place so that when wildfires occur, they know what to do. So prevention and mitigation plans for wildfire.
All really important things. And we'll come back and talk more about those and talk about really how nature-based solutions might play a role in some of those. Before we do that, Jeff and I are curious. We want to hear a bit about you and your background and what makes you tick. Right, Jeff?
That's right. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for our listeners to get to know you, Anabela, and we want to hear more about your journey and how your experience has led you to work with this type of science and engineering practice. What got you interested in wildfires and all of the good stuff that you're doing at the Intact Center?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit about my background. Well, just growing up in general, being an outdoorsy person, enjoying camping, canoeing, kayaking, paddleboarding. And then my parents moved out to a log home, actually, very close to forest. But we had the cleared out area around our home. So I grew up kind of like in that middle of nowhere kind of place where you can just run around. And then, so that led to me doing my PhD in environmental science, where I actually studied tree rings down in South America, in Argentina. And so I got to explore forests all the way from almost the most southern tip of Argentina to North Argentina. I got to see all kinds of forests, mountain forests, drier forests. So I kind of have a love for forests. And the pattern there was that many, many forests were affected by fire. So you could see the fire scars in the tree rings. So I've had an inclination for fire for quite some time. And I had the opportunity to join the Intact Center a year ago. And I started working with our lead on wildfire. We're developing a wildfire report for Canada that's based on some of the best guidance that we have, but we're making it easy to follow for any Canadian to pick up and say, this is what I can do to protect myself from wildfire.
Well, Anabela, it sounds like you and I have more in common than I first thought. I mean, this idea of you growing up in a log cabin in the middle of the woods, that sounds like the life I'm kind of living right now. In fact, over in Down East Maine. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about your experiences in log cabins, and maybe I can learn a little bit from you in that area too.
Quite a bit of upkeep. That's what I can say. Yeah, they're lovely, but yeah.
Yeah, that seems to check out on my end too.
I think it's kind of ironic that as we're taping this show, of course, people can't see us, but Jeff and I are sitting in our log cabins in the woods, and Anabela is sitting in
a concrete apartment. Yeah,
a concrete office at the university. I have to tell you, Anabela, I was absolutely inspired by the guidance that the Intact Center, you and your colleagues at the Intact Center put together on fireproofing. And I did spend the Saturday of the July long weekend with my helpful friends. Not all of my friends that come to the cottage are of the helpful variety. Some are of the lie on the dock variety. But we did spend a good part of Saturday actually clearing out all of the brush, trimming the trees, everything that we could possibly do on the, relatively easy scale to, separate the forest a little bit from the cottage. Really important things to do. I want to go back and pick up where we started with the 2023 wildfire season in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about why it started so early this year and why is it so severe this year?
Yeah, we've kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but it's so severe in Canada this year due to the combined effects of climate change, fire suppression, and population growth in these areas. So on the climate change side, this year was particularly bad because on average across Canada, the winter was milder, we saw less snow, and the spring was drier and warmer. And we had some extreme heat events early in the spring, especially out in Alberta, where I'm sure your listeners heard that that's where the fire really took off this season in May. So the rise in temperature due to climate change affects the three main ingredients of wildfire. The ignition source, so warmer weather leads to more lightning. The fuel, warmer weather and dry days lead to drier tree branches, grasses, trees. And the warmer weather also leads to the extension of fire weather. So fire weather helps spread the fire. So the hot, dry, windy days that we have, that's a great ingredient to make wildfire worse. So the other thing that I mentioned is fire suppression. So for much of the 20th century, putting out fires, which is known as fire suppression, was the goal in Canada. This was successful for some time. However, it's very costly, and it can actually be detrimental to ecosystems that need wildfire to regenerate. And it can lead to more fuel. But in the 1970s, starting in the 1970s, we saw an attitude shift. So going from just fire suppression to a combination of fire management where the response depends now on the priorities. So if a high priority area is being affected, protection of residential areas or high value commercial forests and recreational sites is first. So those fires need to be put out. But if a smaller fire is occurring, it's under control, it might be left to be put out on its own. And the third thing I mentioned is population growth. So people like forested areas. Like we just talked about this, like Sarah and Jeff are right now sitting close to a forest. We enjoy that. But we have to be careful when we move into the wildland urban interface, which is where the forest meets human settlement. So if we live in these areas, we have to make sure to create these fire breaks, cut back our branches from trees, all the things that you were mentioning, Sarah, you did around this weekend in your home.
Fantastic advice, Anabela. Really appreciate you unpacking that for us and allowing us to better understand what needs to be done and how all of the wildfire issues and concerns come into play. I was curious, though, any insight on what's happening perhaps in the U.S.?
Yeah, so the U.S. is getting off to a bit of a slower start. You guys actually had, in the West where your fires tend to occur, you had a bit of a wetter winter. You had all that rain happen and snow happen out in California, and that's protecting you for now. Unfortunately, the expectation is that you will have a dry and warm summer, especially out in California and Arizona. So your season has started. It's starting, but it will probably kick off very soon. And you're going to see generally above normal temperatures for most of the West. That's what's being predicted right now. What I can tell you, though, is it kind of helped us in Canada that your season started off late. The U.S. sent almost 1,500 personnel to help fight fires across our country. So I hope that we can return that favor. Obviously, that's the plan. But we need to get our fires in control to return your people down and then and be able to share our resources.
Clearly, there's a huge need for action on forest fires and on many fronts because the impacts are so widespread. Let's talk about what's being done to prevent forest fires in Canada. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your work at the Intech Centre and the collaborative work that you do with multiple partners, Anabela.
Yeah, so I would say, unfortunately, in general, not much is done on the prevention side. Actually, most of the government funds go towards dealing with fire once it's actually happening. And on average, on an average year, about $1 billion are spent just putting out fires, protecting people, which needs to be done. I do think there needs to be a bit done ahead of wildfire season to prepare, again, around your home, your community. So prevention could lead to smaller fires and could protect communities. So as I mentioned before, that's our focus at the INTAC Center. It's called the INTAC Center for Climate Adaptation because it's about adapting to the changes that we already see are happening with climate. So adapting means get ready before it happens. So we research best practices for residents, communities, businesses, and for government. And what we're looking to do is to increase resilience to extreme weather. So we look at wildfire, extreme heat, and flooding, which your listeners might know when there's a wildfire event, it might be coupled with extreme heat usually, and it could be followed by flooding. So we look at those three main perils. And we work closely with Fire Smart Canada. They've developed just great guidance for communities to become more resilient. And we are finishing the National Wildfire Report, which takes guidance from FireSmart and the National Research Council of Canada. They have provided a wildland or urban interface guidance that's about 200 pages long. Everything's in there, and we're distilling that down for community members to easily understand and incorporate some of the advice around their home and their communities. So as Canada shifts their thinking on fire management practices, there's actually a lot that we can learn from Indigenous cultural burning. Indigenous peoples practice planned and controlled fires for cultural and land management practices. So for wildfire, cultural burning means that you can actually reduce the buildup of forest fuels. It serves for pest management, such as the bark beetle. It serves for ecological restoration, for wildlife habitat enhancement, such as improving the habitat of large mammals, such as the deer and elk. So cultural burns don't actually burn as high or as hot as large fires. They're low intensity fire, which actually deliver nutrients to the soil, whereas a large fire can cause the soil to repel water, increasing runoff and erosion.
So there's lots and lots of resources, and there's lots of really good thinking coming together, as you've mentioned, Anabela, and we'll make sure that we put references in our show notes. You also mentioned that the INTAC Center has been involved in the Canadian Adaptation Report, and that the focus needs to be on how we're adapting to climate change, which is already upon us. Can you talk about some of the highlights from the report? What are they recommending for wildfire prevention and management?
So in the report right now, there's more like targets set up for wildfire. So the idea is to start educating the population. So one of the targets set out in the National Adaptation Strategy is that by 2025, which is a year and a half away, 50% of Canadians are aware of their risk. So are you in a wildfire risk area? Maybe not everybody's aware. And then what their next target is that I think it's about 60% of Canadians have at least taken some measures to prevent some of the risks that they're exposed to. So for us, that means take our infographics. They're easy to follow. There are things that you can do right now. If a few Canadians pick these up and do a few things, we're starting to meet those targets, and you're going to protect yourself and your neighbors if you do things around your home for wildfire.
Fantastic. Well, Anabela, it sounds like there's so much happening in Canada focused on fire prevention. And I was just kind of curious, and you sort of touched on this when you described soils and how soils are changed or impacted as a result of fires. And I was kind of curious, your thoughts on use of nature-based solutions. Obviously, our listeners are really eager to learn more about nature-based solutions and their broad applications. But I was curious if you're tracking on anything that's happening in regard to use of nature-based solutions for the purpose of reducing risk from wildfires, or on the backside where perhaps a wildfire event has occurred and now nature-based solutions and strategies are being integrated to reduce that risk in the future.
So I'm going to call you an innovator, Jeff, because there is very little being done on, I guess, a bit more on the prevention side, but not so much yet on post-fire. And I was looking into this, and I think it's a wonderful idea, how to actually think about nature for prevention for fire, and then post-fire, what we can do. So I'm going to quote my colleague, Joanna Aiken. She always says, learn to work with nature, not against it. Wildfire is no different. So we're usually scared of wildfire. But first of all, we need to remember and continue to acknowledge that wildfire is a natural process and it improves ecosystem health. So we need it. Therefore, our focus does need to shift from suppression to prevention. So as we consider nature-based solutions to wildfire, I would group them into two categories. I'd say vegetation management through removal. And the second category would be creating a fire-resistant landscape through the incorporation of vegetation. So if you're in a wildfire-prone area, you first want to focus on the area close to your home, so up to 10 meters being clear. So forest thinning, creating the 30-meter fire break. So here again, you're getting rid of vegetation, pruning trees to create a 2-meter clearance from the ground up, removing highly flammable vegetation such as conifers from within 10 meters of your home, removing trees from power lines and create a 5-meter radius around the power lines. So that's the step one. Step two is creating a fire-resistant landscape. So at the home level, residents can actually follow FireSmart BC. They have a landscaping guide, which provides a list of fire-resistant or fire-smart plants that residents can use in their gardens. And at a larger scale of the community or watershed, we need to consider diversifying our forests. So if we go in to restore a landscape post-fire, let's think about incorporating climate-smart options such as wetlands or grasslands. So they can serve both to provide ecosystem services such as the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They can provide habitat connectivity, nutrient cycling, but they're also fairly fire resilient. So really, there are ways to do this, but I think it's just starting, Jeff. So this is an excellent idea.
Anabela, this is fantastic information, and thank you so much for sharing all of that good work that's happening and how people can be smart when it comes to wildfires and thinking about them. And certainly within the Army's Engineer Research and Development Center, we also are looking at wildfires and looking at ways that we can integrate in engineering with nature and the strategies associated with engineering with nature to reduce risk. And certainly with wildfires and thinking about the excessive heat and then loss of vegetation post-wildfire event, there's a lot of issues concerning mudslides and erosion. And there are opportunities for nature-based solutions to come back in and retain water in the soils and the sediments. And as you indicated, being in a position to think smart in terms of what vegetation can recruit into those areas and thinking more in terms of wetland preservation and restoration and how wetlands dispersed on the landscape can also help with reducing risk. So later this season, in season 6, we do hope to have our colleagues from the Army's Engineer Research and Development Center that are doing research in this area come on and share with us some of the work that they've been doing, and then also offer thoughts on how systems can be restored post-wildfire events.
I can't wait to hear that episode.
Good. We're interested in hearing your thoughts about what nature-based solutions research would be useful going forward.
I think so. Some of the things that I mentioned are actually very new, and it's something that's being considered. So I actually think this is what needs to be done post fire. What is happening? What are people going back to do? And actually, here in Lytton, BC, which I'm sure you've heard, the whole community burned down during an extreme wildfire event in 2021. And now when they're going back to rebuild, all of these things are being taken into consideration. So how do we build back better? And that's something that we keep bringing up at the center. That's something that the National Adaptation Strategy is bringing up. So you wouldn't go back and build the homes the way that they were before, the landscape the way that it was before. So doing a bit more research on what are some of the best practices. People still want to live close to forests, still want to live close to nature. So how can we have both? So I think looking into some of these restoration practices, some of the work that Jeff's colleagues are doing, it's excellent. I was reading up on the work, and they go in and post-fire and actually use the materials available in the land. It's very difficult to get in with machinery or materials. So they use what's available already, logs that have come down, rocks in the area. So how to use what's available to you and deal with all these perils, as Jeff mentioned. So not just restoring for wildfire, but then once you do that and you add a bit of nature back, you're going to actually lower extreme heat. You're going to retain water. So one thing that you do will actually have many benefits for the ecosystem and the residents that live there.
Thank you, Anabela. And we touched on this earlier, but within the Engineering with Nature program, certainly from where I sit, I see a lot of collaboration and partnering that is occurring. And I know that you too value the partnerships and collaborations that help to yield improvements and drive progress. And so I was wondering here, as part of our conversation today, if you maybe could expand on the engagements that you've participated in the collaborations, and how that is also achieving success for you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. This is a monster of a problem when we talk about climate change in general. So for us to tackle it and the complexity of it, we all have to work together. And at the center, we collaborate very closely with the National Research Council of Canada. So that's where all of our scientists are, where the main research is happening. But in our collaboration, we bring it out to the public and we make it easy to understand and for everyone to work on it. We also work very closely with Standards Council of Canada. We currently have a project that's starting with them on shoreline management for the Great Lakes. We've worked with CSA Group and will continue to do so. We work very closely with municipalities, so we're always in contact. We're also creating a municipal flood risk assessment tool that municipalities of all sizes will be able to use to say, am I at risk, and have I taken any preventative measures? And if not, what can I do? And we work with the other levels of government as well. We're always meeting, we're always sending them our information and suggestions on how we can best reach Canadians. So that really, I think you can kind of hear the thread of our work is to promote user-friendly materials and communication. So getting it out there as much as possible, letting people understand that there's so much that you can do to increase your resistance or decrease your vulnerability to these extreme weather events.
I think that the work that you're doing to really help people understand what the challenges are, what the risks are, but what action can be taken in a very practical way. It's really, really useful. And clearly, strong collaboration, strong action is needed to reduce the risks of wildfires. And to your point, Anabela, it's really everybody's responsibility to do their part. So I'm thinking before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to ask you, what's your call to action for the policymakers, the decision makers around wildfire risk particularly?
My big call to action is let's continue to think about prevention as much as possible. It might be costly in the beginning, but it will pay off in the long run. It will save lives. It will save communities. It will save forests. We're losing forests daily, as we mentioned earlier in the episode. There's a lot that we can do to prepare ahead of time. Let's not get comfortable this winter and think we're out of it. Let's get ready for next spring and start thinking, what can we do? How can we increase the resilience of our communities? So that's my call to action for policymakers. Think ahead, adapt, prepare. Don't just react to the events that are occurring.
And what would your call to action be for citizens?
There's a lot that citizens can do. Sometimes we feel overwhelmed with what's happening. We think it won't happen to me. We think it's happening somewhere else. It's not my problem. Well, let me tell you, it can happen to you. We've had several people come to us and say, I didn't know that my basement could flood. And then I saw what you've been telling us that it could flood, and it did. So think it can happen to you. Think any small action that you do can save you and your neighbors, especially with wildfire. If you do things around your home and encourage your neighbors to do the same, both of your homes will be saved. So there's much that you can do. For campers and cottagers, follow the guidance by the province or the state that you're in. So if there's a fire ban, respect it. No fireworks, don't do fireworks. You might not cause a fire around your home, especially with fireworks. You might cause it somewhere else. So just respect those. We'll get back to normal at some point. Hopefully, you might be able to have a fire later, but you don't need it. We went camping this past long weekend with my kids, and they're understanding why we can't roast marshmallows and have s'mores. So we just ended up doing these like cones full of marshmallows and chocolates, and we just put it on like our MSR like pan, and they loved it. So there are other things that you can do without fire when you're having fun this summer. Get out there and camp, though. I do suggest that.
And adapt, right? It's all about adaptation. We can just adapt and do things a little bit differently. And innovation.
Thinking outside the box a little bit, yeah.
Exactly. Jeff, over to you. What would be your call to action, having heard everything that Anabela has talked about?
Well, I think Anabela has put a nice bow on this conversation for us today. Certainly, I appreciate all of the advice and recommendations that Anabela has shared. And there are several thoughts now that are sort of in my mind, and this idea of collaboration and the fact that wildfires really don't respect borders, and the fact that there's so much good information and so much work happening in Canada and likewise in the US. And how do we share that information and be more transparent in how that information is given to the public? And that's sort of where my mind is right now, is what can we be doing now and in the future that help us to share information and have it be more readily available? And I think that's something I want to ponder a little bit more and think about what kind of collaborative research is needed, how do we pursue that, and then what might be natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions that can be identified and used in advance of a wildfire event, but also following wildfire events. So I love these kind of conversations where it really gets me thinking and wanting to learn more. And that's exactly what this conversation has done today.
Well, I totally agree. You've given us a lot to think about, Anabela, but you've also given us some practical things to go and do at home right now. So thank you. Thank you for putting Canada's wildfire season in perspective for us. But I think also giving us a sense of the work that is being done to prevent forest fires, or if they happen, to minimize the risk to people and to property. The innovative work that you and your colleagues at the Intech Centre are doing with your collaborators across Canada really, I think, gives us hope, and it's inspiring. And I think, to Jeff's point, we need to look at how can we expand that collaboration? How can we expand the work that you're doing in communicating about these risks and how to mitigate them? So thank you for reminding us also that every one of us, it doesn't matter where we live, has a role to play in preventing forest fires. Yeah, thank you, Sarah and Jeff. You doing this podcast is already spreading more information for people. It's getting this out there as much as you can. So you're doing your part, but something to keep thinking about. That's what we're thinking about all the time too. How do we get this out? We have great information, great tools, great organizations that are working on this stuff. So let's get it out to everybody. Thank you for the work that you're doing. This is wonderful.
Anabela, thank you for your time today as well. And please keep us posted. All the information that you continue to accrue, we want to know about it. We certainly want to be able to convey information out to our listeners. And certainly we'll be thinking about you and all of our Canadian colleagues and friends during this very difficult time.
Thank you. And thank you for the support. Again, the U.S. has really supported us with this wildfire season. So we hope to do the same for you. Thank you. And Jeff, thanks for making sure that we talked about wildfires in a timely way. And also for, nudging us into the exploration of how nature-based solutions could help with the work that Anabela and all of the people in the forest industry are doing now. So thanks for that. It's an important topic, and it's certainly one that we'll continue to talk about in future episodes. And for now, we hope that all of you, our listeners,
We'll take whatever action you can to protect your homes, your cottages, and your communities. We'll make sure that you have all the resources that Anabela mentioned in our materials. And just please be vigilant in preventing forest fires, however you can, wherever you live. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or anything that we're working on in the Engineering with Nature program, please give us a call or drop us a note. Details are on the Engineering with Nature website. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again as we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.